I'm thrilled to present the rest of Sue Gardner's amazing talk, which we're going to begin now. You heard it from Sue this morning, just how far the internet has strayed from its idealistic beginnings. For part two of this conversation, she'll be joined by Annette Hester, who has been an incredible advisor and connector to Forward 50 for years, and McGill's Jennifer Welsh. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Forward 50 channel. I'm looking forward to hearing what you say. And Annette, I'm going to leave it to you to kick off with some opening remarks, because I guess that it's probably a good idea for this loud white dude to step back. So Alex, if you want to bring people up, that would be great. And then we can get the conversation started. Hi, Annette.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastically. I'm just so thrilled with the lineup. Amazed to see how we're going to continue this conversation about Sue's things. But as she said, it's time for loud white dudes to get out of the way. So let's hand it over to you for some opening stuff. And then
Thank
I'll be back in
you.
40 minutes.
But we like this white dude there.
Thank you.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I know Sue mentioned that she wanted to have you guys say hello because it's really eerie to be here. I crave being back in Ottawa and hugging you guys and seeing everyone and meeting new people and seeing old friends. But hi, it's lovely to be here. And I mean, all the conversations we've been having, the amazing speakers, kind of doesn't surprise, I'm sure it won't surprise you, that this polarization that we've been feeling is something that is high on my mind. And we know that digital age could be good, but there's a lot of troubling things going on. And this is a subject of a lot of my conversation with my friends, with the people I love and the people that I talk to regularly. And we thought it would be really neat to bring this conversation, just like we have it, to you and make you part of it. And thanks Forward 50 for letting us do that. So until this morning, how many of you knew that a Canadian and this amazing woman ran Wikipedia? Like, come on. So she's back in Canada, and we are absolutely thrilled, right, like Rebecca said. But another recent back to Canada is Jennifer Welsh after decades in Oxford. And Jennifer is now at McGill, and those are two people close to my heart. So we're going to kick off with Sue taking back sort of the narrative of where she was at. Hi, Sue.
Hey, Annette. How are you?
I'm good. I'm at my daughter's house in Vancouver Island. So there's Playmobil mermaids and abacus. And
there's an abacus, yeah.
Yeah, it's smart
nice
stuff.
Nice. I'm in Montreal, and as you know, I'm literally down the hall from Jennifer, but we decided not to be in the same room because that's just going to be reverb and whatever kinds of problems.
Yes, you recently joined McGill, but I'll let you tell in the question and answer.
Sure.
You can talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. So look, I just want to kick off saying thank you. And I think maybe everybody watching this doesn't know this, but you are one of the extraordinary connectors, right? There are these people who have fingers everywhere and know all manner of disparate folks. You introduced me and Jennifer. You've introduced me to other people. I'm sure you've introduced Jennifer to other people. And it's a real gift, right? And I think that this discussion that we're going to have now, my hope is, will be kind of a manifestation of that gift, in the sense that what we're trying to do, I think, is kind of walk the talk of what I was saying in my lightning talk earlier, right? That we need so many different kinds of voices and so many different kinds of expertise and experience and observation brought to bear on the harms that we're seeing coming out of big tech. And this is an attempt to kind of model that, right? To kind of model what discourse might look like if it was a little bit broader. So I'm going to start with you, actually. I'm going to start by interviewing you. And then you're going to interview Jen. And then we're going to bring it back around to me, and we'll throw back to Alistair. And then we're going to do a Q&A in, I forget the name of the app that Wonder Me, right? Wonder.
Yeah, Wonder.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So I'm going to kick off. And I want to kick off by asking you, so, when you think about all the many changes that the internet has wrought, right? I want to ask you to kind of like throw your mind all the way back to the beginning and what you thought would happen, what you might have expected to happen, and how different is what's actually happening. The story so far, it's not over yet, but how different is it today from what you might have expected back in those early days?
Well, to begin with, was an amazing promise. Like, I was so excited. Um, my brother was part of the very beginning of the internet. He had a PhD in computer science at UCLA, and he was always pushing me along, and I could talk to him on screen on this orange compact that the screen split into two. It was amazing. It was sort of, I mean, I'm 65, so I'm kind of like, I go back before computers. It wasn't that far, guys. I really did. I really did. I was already married when computers came about, when I had my first one. But it was, so it was something that connected. And I saw it as this incredible connecting force that I could be and be close to Brazil, which is my homeland, and sort of this instrument of cohesiveness and of bringing together, of making the world a small place. And what I didn't count on is the threat to democracy. And I grew up in a dictatorship, so the threat to democracy is really scary to me, absolutely scary. And the fact that even with my close friends and people that I know for years and years, I don't know if our understanding is common. I don't know that they read the same things that I read. Actually, I know we don't. And then sometimes we are only brought together because we've known each other for so long, and we love each other so much that we love each other in spite of our differences. But I don't even know, like, it's so divergent, this AI feeding your news cycle, and what you see means that I have no common ground. That is really completely unexpected to me. I couldn't write sci-fi that way. I couldn't even see it that way. I wouldn't have seen it. So how polarized. And the second thing that I would never expected, I should have, but I guess in hindsight it's 2020, the changing culture of permissiveness, of really being permissiveness, of treating people in an uncivilized way. It's kind of like, wow, when did that happen?
Well, and I wonder, is it possible? I mean, of course it's possible. Could things have gone differently? Of course they could have, right? I wonder if there are pivotal moments that you could pick out where we could have chosen a different path in some way that would have led us to a different result, not where we are now.
One of the things that really surprises me the most is how hopelessly slow government, and I say we in government because I've been part of many governments and institutional, multilateral institutions and so on, but how slow we have been to react. So now we are reacting to the harms of Facebook, but we already knew that with Cambridge Analytica, or even before. So you talked about the alarm bells of the woman approaching you.
Yep.
But so it's not new. We've known this, but the lack of sort of how far behind and how much and how wide of a berth we have given to this to spread to a point that catching up is incredibly hard. So it's missing in action.
Yeah, and it's super interesting, isn't it? Because I sometimes feel like we went straight from not noticing anything and paying zero attention, all the way into full-blown cries of moral panic. You know what I mean? We never had the middle ground where action was taken. We just went straight into from nothing to this is overblown. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of actors who are arguing the same thing that they've always argued, right? Which is essentially do nothing, leave it alone, right? Which was an easier argument to make in something like 1991 than it is in 2021, right?
Right. And now it's kind of funny because we are seeing different things happening in different places. So some more aggressive stance in different countries and at different times and in different polarization, because now it has become an arm for despots, a tool, not an arm in the hands of despots. As it was mentioned yesterday, and we've had amazing talks and quite shown us like step by step, it's being used as a tool against sort of that is undermining and eating away in democracy. And that is, it is quite troubling in about what do we do about it.
Okay, so I have, in the spirit of full transparency, I have a sheaf of questions for you. I have many questions. I have, I think, 14 questions that I would like to ask you, but I cannot because I think we want to bring in Jennifer. But I might want to ask you one more thing just before we bring in Jennifer. Like, could you speak to, when you think about how we're currently approaching these problems, and I'm talking about liberal democracies for the most part, right? So Canada and countries like Canada, when you think about how we're currently approaching them, if you had to critique the approach, right, what would your criticism be? Or a more positive way to put that would be if you had to give some advice to the people who are forming policy and making decisions about how to handle this kind of stuff, what would that advice be? Or contrary-wise, what would your criticism be for the folks handling this stuff?
Yeah, and I know this is a really international audience, and I'm going to put my heart out for Canada here because a lot of people in this audience, I'm sure, are Canadian government and Canadians, and it's almost like with your call for action. We have a few pieces of legislation that are sort of going through and being drawn, and we also, for some odd reason, and I'm not sure exactly what, have really been missing in action and being very timid, which we didn't used to be. And we are focusing our efforts on the harms and on accountability, on the illness and the symptoms. And we are not looking at the business model. We are not envisioning what is causing this. What is it? And unless we change that, we are going to be hopeless at this accountability. It's going to just keep happening more and more and more, and we won't be able to be effective. It will be a whack-a-mole. You do here and comes up here and comes up there, and it's just going to be, it's not going to happen. So we need to look at the actual construct and the business model, and then envision a way to chip at the business model and together in a macro level with our allies and with the globe, look at the cultural setup and the culture of permissiveness that allows, that says it's okay to have a business model that causes harm. Actually, it's not okay. There's nowhere that this is okay. So why has we accepted that this is an okay business practice? It's not an okay business practice. How do we change the culture? And in terms of changing culture, I think that's where I love bringing a completely different thinking, and why I introduced to Jennifer and why I keep thinking of Jennifer because
Bring Jennifer in. Bring her in.
please.
I will step back. Go ahead. Bring Jen in. That would be great.
Hi, Jen.
Hi, good to see you.
Yes. And the reason why it was so important to bring Jen in is because she's one of the people that work and drafted together and helped put together the entire doctrine of responsibility to protect. And if there is something that I think, especially me as a grandma, I like, what do I want to do? I want to protect my baby. I want to protect all this. It just feels that it's a responsibility. It's my responsibility. So it kind of sets me up for that. But before we go there and apply to this case, could you indulge us, be a prof, wonderful prof that you are, and tell us about responsibility to protect? What is it? What is it designed to do? Where did it come from? Like, how did it get there?
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit more about the doctrine, about what it is, please.
Sure, and it's great to have this conversation with you and with Sue. So the best way to think about responsibility to protect is as a policy framework.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really designed to try to draw a new line between the domestic sphere and the international sphere in one area of human behavior and activity. And that is with respect to those acts which we as a international community as a whole have deemed to be criminal acts. There actually are very few international crimes as opposed to domestic crimes or national crimes. And those that are international crimes, 3 of them that you may know about are genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And the responsibility to protect policy framework was designed to develop new approaches to preventing and responding to those acts. And so it really made 3 important moves that hadn't existed before. And the first was to change the way we talk about addressing these acts from one where outsiders have a right to potentially intervene or address them, to the idea that we all have a shared responsibility to prevent and respond to these crimes. If we deem them to be acts that shock the international community as a whole, we all have a responsibility at different levels, at the local level, the national level, the international level, and indeed at the individual level. Individuals in the roles that they inhabit in society also have a responsibility to protect populations from these acts. And the second part of the framework is that it foresaw a spectrum of activities. So those of you online listening to us today may have heard of responsibility to protect, and in your mind, you associate it with military intervention. If these things are happening in a country, it means you go in with an army and you address it. The policy framework was not designed to emphasize that. It saw that as the last possible act you might take in very particular circumstances and after certain conditions have been fulfilled. It was designed as a preventive agenda to actually avoid the need for having boots on the ground. And so responsibility to protect involves prevention, response, and the aftermath of taking actions. And the third piece of it, Annette, was that this policy framework really did take seriously the idea of these acts as crimes. And if you think about what crimes are, they have 3 dimensions. Firstly, crimes have perpetrators. Secondly, they have, and thirdly, they're underpinned by a crime situation. And what the policy framework was designed to do was to work at each of those dimensions. So to say, how do we deny perpetrators the means to commit these acts or try to change their incentives so that they don't commit them? Secondly, how do we make victims less vulnerable? How do we act in different ways to make them less likely to be harmed in the dramatic ways associated with responsibility to protect? And then thirdly, how do we make the environment less permissive? And if you think about
the change of
how this
culture.
can work, yeah, I mean, you mentioned this word permissiveness. You can do that at the 11th hour by saying, okay, we deny you the tools to commit these crimes. But earlier on, in a preventive sense, you work at norms, you work at education, you work at changing political and economic structures. So it was really a holistic approach to thinking about how do we create a collective shared responsibility to better protect populations.
And how long did it take to get there?
It's a
Because
long journey,
I'm like,
and it's an unfinished journey. Any of our listeners who have been part of the human rights movement will know this is a 100-year effort in which different generations take part. But with respect to responsibility to protect, I think the earliest moments are right after the Second World War and the response to the Holocaust, where for the first time, we created forms of international criminal accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide. But there was very bumpy and selective implementation. As we know, it wasn't until we got to the 1990s and the genocide in Rwanda and the genocide in Srebrenica that you really saw the development of responsibility to protect. And it, from that point onward, became endorsed as a principle by all heads of state and government in 2005. And since then, there have been efforts to implement that very specific policy framework with ups and downs. And as you've talked about, and Sue talked about, yeah, our current environment is very difficult for these kinds of agendas, but they're still important.
Yeah, and can you talk, you mentioned two things that I thought were really interesting, and I'll go by parts. The first one, you talked about prevention versus accountability. So can you talk about what is the experience with this accountability? Because I keep thinking if we treat the consequences, I make people accountable. Is that enough? Where do I get when I do that? Do I get to where I want to go?
Accountability is hugely important, and it's important in the domain we're talking about today, because you do need to create an environment where impunity isn't rampant, where you can't commit these kinds of actions and not be accountable. But accountability, at least in the domain that I've been working at, is only one sliver of the solution for a couple of reasons. Firstly, in the accountability we have seen for international crimes, there's been a deliberate strategy of focusing on those in leadership positions who are the kind of highest value figures that you can hold accountable. Slobodan Milosevic, whoever it might be. But the reality is that these acts can be committed at various levels by enormous numbers of people. And accountability mechanisms are by definition and by their implementation selective. They're important. But secondly, the empirical evidence we have for how and whether accountability actually deters people from undertaking these acts is very patchy. It's very difficult to prove. We have some evidence, but clearly if you want to engage in true prevention, you have to be involved much earlier and working on social norms, working on relationships between communities, on building the right institutions, on creating mechanisms for dialogue, on education. You can't pin all your hopes on accountability because compliance and accountability is at the end of the line. And so this has to be much more holistic if you want to make a difference.
Yeah, I can see that. There's no agreeing or disagreeing with this, but I can completely see that, and it really helps. The other thing that it really that I thought was really interesting is that individual versus collective responsibility, because I thought it was really kind of interesting that in Canada, for us, we have this idea, we have this image of ourselves as very different than the US and very benign look of who and what our society is. And I'm not sure that the evidence that we are seeing right now pans out to that, to actually that image, or at least the image that I have. And I even play it out myself at times that I tend to say things are not as bad, and but they're not that good either. In particularly when I see sort of the way journalists are treated, the way even politicians are treated. Come on, I mean, they're politicians and they will stand for something, you either vote or you don't, or you disagree, but you are respectful. But people are not being respectful. And it took a pandemic to remind Canadians that we have a responsibility to our community, that our responsibility to our community is perhaps at times more important than our individual rights. Like that individual versus collective, responsibility versus right. And I think that you mentioned that, and I think that that's a really interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when you think about using the word right, it could convey two things, right? You have an entitlement, but it can also mean you have a right to do it, but you don't have an obligation. It's discretionary. And responsibility is a more demanding idea in that sense. And so that's why the community that developed responsibility to protect was keen to try to foster this notion of a shared responsibility. And Annette, I agree with you. I don't think there's anything special in the water we drink in Canada that makes us immune from these kinds of divisive dynamics.
Yes.
I think our institutions are different, and institutions are important, and they play a role in shaping dynamics, but we should not be complacent. I think one of the most troubling aspects of some of the debates we see, particularly around online harms, but also related developments in society, is that we have a leadership that is extremely complacent about the strength of democracy. Because it doesn't have a historical perspective about times when states were not democratic, that leadership thinks it can push democracies to the limit and they won't go over the cliff. They won't collapse. I don't believe that. I believe democracies can go over the cliff. And therefore, you have to think about, I believe that they are fragile. They have to be nurtured day by day by day, by every generation anew. And that's where the individual responsibility comes in. So when we think about the change in culture, the change in the climate of permissiveness that we tried to create with responsibility to protect, we tried to say, you know, 100 years ago, you could do whatever you wanted to your own people inside your sovereign jurisdiction. This principle tries to say the goalposts are changing. That isn't acceptable any longer. The international community does care, does see itself as having a role. But individuals matter in that. So when you think about any role you play, one of the interesting things we tried to argue was that even UN officials, who are important to the responsibility to protect, because the UN as an organization have choices about how they're going to respond to a specific crisis. And we tried to say individuals need to exercise moral courage, even if they're UN officials, let alone if there's someone trying to prevent a crisis from escalating locally in their village. Every individual has a role. Every individual has a role in sustaining our democracy. And it's not just about voting. It's about keeping the climate of dialogue and solving problems without resort to violence. That's really what it's all about.
Wow. Absolutely. Time maybe to sort of how do we tie it all back into the legislation and responsibility to protect, but applied, does it apply, or how do we see that in harms legislation and perhaps even a new regulator and so on? And I wanted to know if we can bring Sue in. Can we have the three of us, Alex? There she is.
Hey, We have the three. Great.
We love it.
I was wanting to jump in. There were many times that I was wanting to jump in. If we were to structure something like this again, I think we would all be together all the time. I don't know. But yeah, that was so interesting. And there's so much in that that is rich and useful. And obviously we are not going to neatly tie with a bow anything here. But I wanted to follow up a little bit on the sort of piece of the conversation that was about Canada and Canada's distinct sort of cultural realities. Because Annette, I wanted to call you out a little bit, even when you were talking about Canadians sort of seeing ourselves as sort of mild and sort of a safe place and all that sort of thing. You were talking about the online harms, and I think you used the phrase, I wrote it down, not being respectful, that people were not always being respectful of the Prime Minister. And that is itself a very mild way to say that. That's a very understated, right? Like we can't help ourselves.
I do it, and I even realized after
I
because I
know.
said I do that
I
myself.
thought I saw you catch it, right? Because we
I
all
caught it.
do it.
I
I
do
do
that.
it too, right? But it's not a question
I
of
do
not being
that.
respectful, and that puts it in a bucket of like, oh, kids today or whatever, right? The decline in civility. And it's not that someone threw gravel at the Prime Minister, right? Some events were shut down and unable to be staged because of concerns about security. I mean, it's not January 6th in Canada, but it's also not nothing. I am not lecturing you. I know you know
You're
that,
absolutely
right?
right, because I do that all the time because
We all do.
I can't bear to see us. I can't bear what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
So it's almost like if I name it, then
Mhm.
that shall not be named.
Yes.
And then it's not there, or I don't give it power, which is not true.
That's
because
right.
I can't believe that that a minister gets threatened in front of their kids or anytime.
Driven out of politics every day, right?
Like, what's
Journalists. I
that
saw a
about?
headline the other day that was female novelists were retiring from writing novels because they couldn't bear the amount of harassment they were getting. So yeah, no, and I think on the Canadian point, I feel that very keenly. And I think we all do, the three of us, in different ways, because we've lived somewhere else. Annette, you're from Brazil, but Jennifer, you lived in the UK, I lived in the United States. And I think maybe that gives us a little extra, I don't know, glimmer of insight into how fragile this stuff is. And you get some distance, right? Like you leave the country and then when you come back, I know when I came back, I was gone for 15 years. When I came back in those 15 years, I did have a sense many times, right? I remember when Colton Boushie, when the trial was happening in Saskatchewan, I happened to be out west visiting my father, and I felt like listening to Cross Country Checkup on the CBC, I could feel what sounded like NRA talking points from farmers in Saskatchewan, right? It sounded like maybe they'd spend a little time on Reddit or something. You can feel the shifting changes in this country. And so, Jennifer, I just wanted to underscore, I think it's really important, this idea that we have an individual responsibility to be attuned, right? To be paying attention, to not be covering our eyes or not sort of, it's such a shame that we're anchored to the United States, right? Because it sort of sets a bar and then we're kind of like, well, we're not that bad, so we must be fine. And that's just like, I think that's dangerous.
And we did that
also
with our
have-
performance on the pandemic too, right? We were constantly saying, well, as long as we're
Right.
not worse, then we're doing fine. And rather than thinking about advanced democracies elsewhere in the world that were actually doing spectacularly well. But I
Mhm.
think, the notion, especially in the world we're living in where power globally is moving around, right?
Mm.
The United States is still incredibly important, but relatively, it's not as powerful as it was. And with all of these agendas, if you approach them as being for others, not for you, because it's not as serious for you, you don't gain traction in the world that we live in. I saw this with responsibility to protect, because I would say in my work to predominantly advanced countries, if you treat responsibility to protect as a foreign policy issue, i.e., we're doing this to help countries that are going to have atrocity crimes, it's dead. These dynamics could affect any country. We know in Canada, we're going through a reckoning with our historical past. No society is immune from these dynamics. They can be better or worse insulated, of course. They can have inhibitors to these things in place, but they are not by nature immune. And unless we approach it as something of a shared challenge, it's really difficult to get traction.
Yes. So going back to sort of what's in front of us, which is our legislation as we come about, do you see, Sue, in the call that you've made this morning for us to engage and not think ourselves as not capable of thinking about the challenges that this digital era is bringing, to immerse ourselves into it and see how our contribution is valid and it enriches the conversation? Do you see where using frameworks such as responsibility to protect and bringing people from completely different areas, is that sort of take us to more towards what you're envisioning?
Yeah, I can absolutely. I mean, both on a kind of a literal level, you can see how things could be applied, right? Like how a lot of the concepts could be applied to the online harm sort of space, right? But also, it's a funny thing. I wasn't thinking this before. This is a new thought, a new thought. But I find myself there's a real timidity around, as you correctly said, Annette, around the internet stuff, right? Like everybody is very scared to make a misstep, and there's a lot of sort of folks poised to critique and so forth. And that's inappropriate for the nature of the challenge, I think, because the challenge and the problems are emergent, right? And I think that means you must take an exploratory approach, and you must accept that there are going to be mistakes are going to be made, and the stuff is going to have to iterate, everywhere, right? Germany, the UK, Australia, everybody is changing their minds and going back and doing things differently. That's just the nature of the challenge. And a funny thing that I didn't expect out of this conversation, but it occurs to me now, the kind of thing that Jennifer has been talking about, the doctrine or the framework, as you say, it goes back, or as you say, as though I know, okay, it goes back to the Second World War, right? Is what you said, right?
Originally, to the experience of atrocity crimes in the mid 20th century,
right? And so the very fact that it is something that people have been talking and nuancing and debating and working through and finessing for such a long time, I think there's something reassuring, or should be something reassuring, in the idea that there are models, right? There are models, there are parallels, there are other places that can be looked to where the conversations have been happening, right? It's not perfect, like you can't perfectly copy over things from other realms, but these discussions aren't new. And I think, the themes, the challengers, the broad strokes of the conversations are not new, right? And one of the things that I find interesting is we're in some ways we're behaving as though it is new with online harm stuff, like we're relitigating hate speech, which is never a settled issue, but it's an issue that countries have determined what they think is right for them. It's a conversation that doesn't end, but we're reopening old questions in a funny kind of a way. So I wonder if parallels to other realms give us some solidity and some reassurance that it's not actually greenfield. It's not really new terrain, right? There's lots of relevant disciplines and relevant areas. Anyway, I think we have to wrap up or we're going to get kicked out. And I don't know what happens. Do we summon Alistair? And then he just appears.
Yeah, ta-da! By magic.
Perhaps he will arrive.
Oh my God, tag me 3 times and I appear. That's how this works.
We clap our hands.
Magic. Star Trek.
I'm going to say, Jennifer, it's amazing to watch a clear legal mind. The whole thing you did about there's a difference between obligation and these are the laws in the international. I love it when someone gives me a clear framework on which to build. And I think you did a fantastic job laying some of that out. And Annette, your personal experiences seeing this stuff is our cautionary tale. I pull my punches all the time and it bothers me. I have had times where I'm like, stop giving me the side eye for wearing a mask and trying to save my fellow humans. And I think something that's happened in the last 2 years is we've all become aware that we have very different frames of references. And it's so easy to slide into that. And therefore you're bad and I'm good, because that's how humans are wired. And for millennia, we had our village and our tribe, and that's what we stood up for. And evolutionarily, it was good. And we have to find new ways of thinking. And I'm kind of sick of pulling my punches. And I love that you called that out, Sue, because if we don't learn to punch, and I hate to use violent metaphors, but I'll use them, we're going to get punched. And I don't think that this stuff is democracy won't stand up by itself. So I love that you're tackling this issue.